The hospital hallways were quiet except for the sound of rain hitting the large glass windows. It was late, close to midnight, and most of the staff had already gone home. Only a few nurses and doctors were still on call. Among them was Dr. Maya Thompson, a calm and focused woman who had been working for nearly 14 hours straight. Her eyes were tired, but her mind was sharp as ever. She had seen many long nights in the emergency department, and she knew this one would not be different. Just as she was about to grab a cup of coffee, the loudspeaker broke through the silence. Trauma incoming. Female, late 50s, vehicle accident, heavy bleeding, multiple injuries. ETA 5 minutes. Maya put down the cup and straightened her coat. She called to the nurse at the station. Get trauma room 2 ready. Page the surgical team now. Within minutes, the calm hospital became a storm of movement. Nurses prepared the instruments, checked the oxygen tanks, and pulled the curtains around the trauma bay. The air carried that familiar scent of antiseptic and urgency. Maya washed her hands quickly, tied her hair back, and put on her gloves. When the paramedics burst through the doors, the stretcher came in fast. A woman lay on it, pale, blood covering her clothes. The paramedic's voice was tense. Name's Margaret Hill, 57. Found unconscious after a head-on collision. Blood pressure's dropping fast. We've already given fluids and oxygen, but she's crashing. Maya's eyes moved over the patient's body in seconds. Get her on the table. Start 2 large IV lines. I need cross-match for blood immediately. Margaret moaned faintly, her face swollen, one arm bent at an odd angle. The heart monitor beeped unevenly. Maya's calm voice filled the room as she gave orders. Pressure's low, give another unit of saline. Prep for ultrasound. We need to find the source of the bleeding. As the nurses worked, Maya placed the probe on the woman's abdomen. The screen flickered, showing a dark pool of fluid. Internal bleeding. Page the OR, we're going up now. There was no hesitation in her voice. She didn't know who this woman was or what her story might be. All she saw was a life hanging by a thread, and that was enough. The team rushed to the elevator, pushing the stretcher down the corridor. The sound of the wheels echoed against the walls. Maya walked beside the gurney, one hand on the patient's shoulder. Hang in there. We're going to take care of you, she said softly, though she knew the woman probably couldn't hear her. When they reached the operating room, everything moved fast. The nurses prepared the sterile instruments, the anesthesiologist inserted the breathing tube, and the monitor began to show a weak rhythm. Maya took a deep breath before beginning the surgery. Her mind went into a different space, one of quiet focus. The outside world faded, and all that mattered was what was in front of her. Scalpel, she said, and the nurse handed it over. She made the first incision with precision. The bleeding was worse than she expected. A torn spleen, ruptured vessel, and bruised intestines, the kind of injuries that didn't forgive mistakes. Maya worked carefully, her hands steady. Sweat formed under her surgical cap, but her eyes didn't waver. The hours passed slowly. Every second felt like a small battle. At one point, the patient's heart rhythm faltered. The alarm blared, and one of the nurses shouted, "She's going down!" "Stay with me," Maya said firmly. She applied pressure to stop the bleeding and ordered more blood. "Start compressions if needed." "We're not losing her tonight." The anesthesiologist nodded, ready. For a moment it looked like Margaret's heart might stop. Then, after a tense minute, the rhythm steadied again. Maya didn't relax. She continued stitch by stitch, sealing each wound, stopping each leak. Her gloved hands moved with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times, yet every patient still felt like the first. After almost 4 hours, the bleeding finally stopped. The monitors showed a stable heart rate. Maya stepped back, her body aching, her gloves stained with blood. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "She's going to make it," she said quietly. The team nodded, relief showing on their tired faces. When the surgery was done, they transferred the patient to the recovery room. Maya stayed behind for a few minutes, cleaning up, checking the report, and making sure the notes were complete. She always believed that her responsibility didn't end when the surgery did. As she walked out of the OR, she saw Nurse Helen waiting with a cup of water. "That was rough," Helen said softly. "Yeah," Maya replied, taking the drink. "She lost a lot of blood, but she's stable now. Let's hope she pulls through the night." Helen nodded but hesitated before speaking again. "You know who that was, right?" Maya frowned. "I just know her name's Margaret Hill. Why?" The nurse shifted uncomfortably. "She's kind of known around here. She lives in the South End, owns that small antique shop near the park. People say she's had some, well, Strong opinions. Maya looked at her curiously. Strong opinions? Helen sighed. You know, she said things about folks like us. About people of color. Not the nicest things. She even had a complaint once because she didn't want a black nurse treating her. Maya stood quietly for a moment. I see, she said finally. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were thoughtful. Helen quickly added, I just thought you should know. But you did what you always do. You saved her life. Maya gave a small smile. That's my job. I don't choose who deserves it. She turned toward the ICU. Let's make sure she wakes up tomorrow. The night grew quieter after that. The rain outside slowed to a drizzle and the world seemed to hold its breath. In the ICU, Margaret lay connected to machines, her chest rising and falling with each mechanical breath. Her face looked peaceful now, almost innocent. No one would have guessed the kind of pain and anger she carried in her heart when she was awake. Maya stood by her bedside, watching the monitors. She felt a strange mix of exhaustion and calm. Moments like this reminded her why she had become a doctor. She remembered her grandmother's words from years ago. You don't heal people because they're kind. You heal them because you can. She gently adjusted the blanket over Margaret and whispered, You're safe now. The nurse entered quietly with fresh linens and checked the IVs. You going home soon, Dr. Thompson? Maya shook her head. Not yet. I'll stay another hour. I want to make sure her vitals stay steady. The nurse smiled. You always do. It was nearly 3 a.m. when Maya finally left the ICU. The hospital was silent except for the distant beeping of machines. As she walked down the corridor, her mind replayed the night. The chaos, the rush, the moment when Margaret's heart almost stopped. When she stepped outside, the cool air hit her face. The rain had stopped and the streetlights reflected off the wet pavement. She pulled her coat tighter and took a deep breath. Saving lives was never easy, but it was what she was born to do. Across town, the wreckage of the car still sat on the roadside, twisted metal and shattered glass. The paramedics had said the other driver walked away with minor injuries. Margaret hadn't been so lucky. For now, though, she was alive. And that was all that mattered. The next morning, Maya returned to check on her patient before starting new rounds. The ICU nurse greeted her with a tired smile. Good morning, doctor. She made it through the night. Blood pressure's holding. Oxygen levels are good. Maya nodded, relieved. Good, keep monitoring her. I'll come back this afternoon. As the day went on, Maya treated other patients, performed another surgery, and attended meetings. But in the back of her mind, she kept thinking about Margaret Hill. It wasn't the racism that bothered her. She had faced worse before. It was the irony of it all. The woman whose life she had fought so hard to save might never even want to look her in the eye. Late in the evening, Maya went back to the ICU. Margaret was still unconscious, but her color had improved. Her breathing was steadier. Maya checked the chart, adjusted the IV, and wrote a few notes. A nurse walked in with a clipboard. Her family finally called. She has a sister, but she's out of state. Said she'll try to come tomorrow. Good, Maya said softly. She'll need some familiar faces when she wakes up. The nurse hesitated. You really think she'll be okay? Maya nodded. Physically, yes. Emotionally, I don't know. Some wounds take longer to heal. After finishing her notes, Maya stood by the bedside one last time. She looked at the woman she had fought for all night. A stranger whose beliefs might have condemned her if their positions were reversed. Yet none of that mattered now. She whispered under her breath, You're alive because a team cared enough to fight for you. I hope one day you'll understand that. When she left the room, the sky outside was beginning to turn a soft shade of blue. The world was waking up again, and so would Margaret soon. Maya didn't expect gratitude. She never did. But she did hope that when Margaret opened her eyes, she would see more than just the color of the hands that saved her. She hoped she would see humanity, raw, real, and equal. For now, the hospital settled back into its quiet rhythm. Machines hummed softly, nurses moved between rooms, and the smell of morning coffee filled the air. In a world often divided by fear and prejudice, one simple truth had just played out. Compassion didn't ask questions about who deserved it. And though Maya didn't know it yet, the real story was only beginning. When Margaret opened her eyes, the world around her, and within her, would start to change. But for this night, one doctor's steady hands and unshaken heart had done what they were meant to do. Protect life. without judgment, without hesitation, and without hate. Morning sunlight slipped through the thin curtains of the ICU room, casting a soft glow on the white walls. The machines hummed quietly beside the hospital bed, marking every heartbeat and breath. The smell of antiseptic mixed with the faint scent of coffee drifting in from the nurse's station. Dr. Maya Thompson walked in quietly, holding her tablet. She had been at the hospital since dawn, making her rounds before the rest of the team arrived. The night had been long but steady. Her patient, the woman she had operated on just hours earlier, was still stable. Maya stood at the bedside watching her. The woman's face was pale, but her breathing was calm. Tubes ran from her arm to the IV stand, carrying fluids and medication. The heart monitor's steady beeping was the only sound in the room. "Good morning, Mrs. Hill," Maya said softly, even though the woman was still unconscious. "You're doing better today. Your body's fighting, that's good." She checked the vital signs again and made a few notes. Everything looked promising. The blood pressure was holding steady, oxygen levels were good, and the swelling around the abdomen had started to go down. Nurse Helen entered with a smile. "You've been here since 5 again, haven't you?" Maya smiled slightly. "Couldn't sleep much. Wanted to see how she was doing." Helen placed a tray on the counter. "You know, most doctors would have gone home by now. But not you," Maya shrugged. "It's hard to rest when someone's still in critical care. Besides, I was the one who opened her up. I need to be sure she's okay." Helen nodded. "Well, she's lucky. Not everyone gets this kind of attention." Maya didn't respond. Her eyes stayed on the woman's face, watching for any sign of movement. By late morning, the hospital began to fill with life again. Doctors walking briskly through hallways, nurses exchanging patient reports, and the distant sound of phones ringing. Maya went to the staff lounge for a quick break, grabbing a cup of black coffee. She sat near the window, watching the gray clouds drift outside. Her mind wandered back to the surgery, the tension, the moment when everything could have gone wrong, and the relief when it didn't. But what lingered in her mind wasn't just the operation, it was the conversation afterward. The way Helen had said, "You know who that was, right?" The quiet weight of those words still echoed in her thoughts. It wasn't the first time Maya had treated someone with prejudice in their heart. Over the years, she had seen many faces, some kind, some cold, some openly hateful. She had learned to keep her emotions separate from her duty, but every time it left a mark, small, silent, but real. After her coffee, Maya went back to the ICU. When she entered the room again, something was different. The woman's fingers twitched slightly. Her eyelids moved. Maya leaned forward. "Mrs. Hill, can you hear me?" she said softly. The woman stirred, her breathing changing slightly. Then slowly her eyes opened. They were hazy and confused, blinking against the bright light. Maya smiled gently. "You're in the hospital. You were in a car accident, but you're safe now." Margaret blinked again, her voice weak and raspy. "What happened?" "You had a serious accident," Maya said, keeping her tone calm. "You were unconscious when they brought you in. We performed surgery to stop the internal bleeding. You're recovering now." Margaret looked around, disoriented. The machines, the wires, the tubes, everything seemed strange. Then her gaze landed on Maya. For a moment, she stared quietly, trying to process what she saw. Maya could sense the hesitation, the subtle tension in the air. She had seen that look before, the quick assessment, the silent question forming behind someone's eyes. "I'm Dr. Thompson," Maya said gently. "I'm the surgeon who operated on you. You're going to be okay, but you'll need rest." Margaret's eyes widened slightly. Her lips parted, but she didn't speak. Her mind was still cloudy from the medication, but there was something sharp behind her stare. Confusion, discomfort, maybe even disbelief. Maya smiled politely and adjusted the IV line. "You'll start feeling stronger soon. Try to rest, okay?" Margaret didn't answer. She closed her eyes again, her face tightening as if she was trying to remember something, or maybe trying not to think at all. Later that afternoon, as Maya was finishing her rounds, Helen caught up with her in the hallway. "I heard she woke up," Helen said. "She did," Maya replied. "Still weak but alert. How'd she take it?" Maya hesitated for a second. "She didn't say much, but I could tell she noticed me." Helen sighed. "Well, she'll have a lot to think about. Maybe this will change her." Maya smiled faintly. "People don't change that easily, but maybe it's a start." Over the next 2 days, Margaret grew stronger. She could talk now, though her voice was still thin and shaky. The nurses helped her sit up, and she started eating small meals. But every time Maya entered the room, Margaret's face would stiffen. At first, she tried to stay polite. "Morning, Mrs. Hill," Maya would say, checking the chart. "How are you feeling today?" Margaret would give short answers. "Fine. Tired. When can I go home?" There was no warmth, no gratitude, only a quiet distance. The nurses noticed it too. One of them mentioned it softly to Maya when they passed in the corridor. "She only talks when you're not around," the nurse whispered. "But when she does, she keeps asking for a different doctor." Maya nodded calmly. "That's okay. Let her rest. I'll still check on her." But even as she said it, she could feel the familiar sting. Not anger, not even sadness, and just that quiet, heavy disappointment that came from knowing that kindness was being met with suspicion. One afternoon, while Maya was reviewing test results in her office, she got a call from the nurse's desk. "Dr. Thompson, Mrs. Hill is asking for you. She says it's important." Maya stood and walked down the hall. When she entered the room, Margaret was sitting up in bed, her arms crossed tightly. "You wanted to see me?" Maya asked. Margaret's eyes narrowed. "I just wanted to ask." "Why you?" Maya tilted her head slightly. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Why were you the one to operate on me?" Margaret said, her tone cautious but sharp. "Wasn't there someone else?" "Someone more experienced?" Maya stayed calm. "I was the senior surgeon on call that night. It was an emergency and we didn't have time to wait for anyone else." Margaret frowned, her lips tightening. "So you're saying—" "You saved my life?" "Yes," Maya said quietly. "My team and I did." The silence that followed was thick. Margaret looked away, her jaw clenching. She seemed to be fighting something inside herself. Pride, discomfort, maybe shame. Maya spoke gently. "You were in critical condition. We did everything we could to keep you alive. You're healing well now. That's what matters." Margaret didn't reply. Her eyes stayed fixed on the wall. Maya adjusted the monitor and turned to leave. But before she reached the door, Margaret muttered under her breath, "Well, I suppose I should say thank you." Maya paused, glancing back. "You don't have to," she said kindly. "Just focus on getting better." Then she left the room quietly. That night, Maya sat alone in the hospital cafeteria, stirring a cup of tea. Around her, the night staff chatted softly, some laughing, others too tired to speak. She stared out the window at the rain beginning again, her reflection faint in the glass. She thought about how strange life was, how people could carry hate in their hearts and still need saving from those they judged. She had seen it before, but somehow each time felt new. It wasn't the hatred that stayed with her. It was the sadness behind it, the fear, the misunderstanding. Meanwhile, in the ICU, Margaret lay awake staring at the ceiling. Her mind replayed what she'd been told on that a black doctor had saved her life. Every part of her wanted to ignore it, to pretend it didn't matter. But the truth kept pressing in. She thought of the night of the accident, though her memory was hazy. She remembered the headlights, the rain, the sound of metal crushing, then darkness. When she woke up, she'd seen that face, and calm, confident, kind. And now, the more she thought about it, the more it bothered her. Not because Maya had done something wrong, but because it challenged everything Margaret had always believed. For years, Margaret had lived in a small bubble of her own making. She had grown up hearing certain words, certain ideas, and that people were different, that some belonged and others didn't. She had repeated those words without thinking, wearing them like armor. But now the same kind of person she had once dismissed had held her life in her hands and given it back. The thought made her chest tighten. She didn't want to feel grateful, but she did. She didn't want to feel wrong, but she was starting to. The next morning, Maya came in again, as always. She smiled politely, greeted her patient, and began her routine checks. Margaret didn't say much, but she watched her closely. The calm way Maya moved, the gentleness in her voice, the quiet confidence in everything she did. It was hard to hate someone like that. A few days later, Margaret's sister arrived, a quiet woman with tired eyes who hugged her and cried softly. When Maya came in to talk to them, the sister stood and smiled. "Doctor, thank you so much for saving my sister." "We're so grateful," Maya returned the smile. "I'm glad she's recovering well. It was a tough surgery, but she's strong." Margaret looked away, pretending to adjust her blanket. She didn't join in the thanks, but when her sister stepped out for a phone call, she looked at Maya and said quietly, "You really stayed here all night?" "During the surgery?" "Yes," Maya said. "We all did. It was a team effort." Margaret's eyes softened for a moment, then she quickly looked down. "I see," Maya nodded. "Rest is your main job now. We'll keep watching your progress. You're doing well." When she left, Margaret leaned back in bed staring at the ceiling again. For the first time, she didn't feel angry. She felt unsettled, because something inside her was shifting and she didn't know what to do about it. That night, Maya passed by the ICU before heading home. She looked through the small window in the door. Margaret was awake, reading quietly, the soft glow of the bedside lamp lighting her face. Maya didn't go in. She just smiled faintly and kept walking. Outside, the rain had stopped and the night air felt fresh. The hospital lights glowed behind her and the city was quiet. Somewhere inside, a woman who had once believed one thing was beginning to see another truth. And for Maya, though she didn't know it yet, this small, silent change was the start of something much bigger than a single surgery. It was the beginning of a lesson that neither of them would ever forget. The morning lights spilled gently into the hospital room, soft and golden. The beeping of the monitor blended with the low hum of air from the vent. Outside, a nurse rolled a medicine cart down the hallway, wheels squeaking quietly with each turn. The world was waking up, and inside this small room, so was something else. Something less visible but no less powerful. Margaret Hill sat upright in her bed, staring at the tray in front of her. Breakfast, oatmeal, fruit, and a cup of coffee that was more warm than hot. She stirred it absent-mindedly with a spoon. Her hands still trembled a little, though the bruises on her arms were starting to fade. The accident had been over a week ago, but she still felt the ache deep inside her body. Some of it was pain from the crash. Some of it was something she couldn't name. Every time she thought about the surgery, about the woman who had stood over her, hands steady, voice calm, her chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with her injuries. The door opened quietly, and Dr. Maya Thompson walked in, holding her tablet. Her white coat moved slightly as she stepped inside, her face calm as always. "Good morning," Maya said with a soft smile. "How are we feeling today?" Margaret looked up briefly. "Fine," her voice was short. "Any pain?" "Just a little," Maya nodded, walking closer. "That's normal. Your body's still healing. You're making good progress, though." She checked the monitor, then gently touched Margaret's wrist to feel her pulse. Her fingers were warm, her touch light. Margaret pulled her hand back slightly. "Do you have to do that?" Maya didn't react. "Just checking circulation." "All good." She noted something on her tablet. "You'll probably be able to start walking more tomorrow. The physical therapist will help you get started." Margaret didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the blanket, her face tight. Maya finished her notes and gave a small smile. "If you need anything, just press the button. I'll check on you later." She turned toward the door, but before she could leave, Margaret said quietly, "Why do you keep being so nice to me?" Maya stopped. The question hung in the air, unexpected but heavy. She turned back slowly. "Because it's my job to care for my patients," she said simply. "No matter who they are." Margaret's face twitched, her eyes flicking away. "Even if your patient doesn't—" "Like you?" Maya paused, her voice gentle. "You don't have to like me, but I'm still here to make sure you get better." Then she left, closing the door softly behind her. Margaret sat still for a long time, staring at the space where Maya had been standing. Her words echoed in her mind. "You don't have to like me, but I'm still here." She picked up the cup of coffee again, but couldn't bring herself to drink it. Later that day, a nurse came in to help her walk for the first time. The nurse, a cheerful man named Oliver, adjusted the support belt around her waist and smiled. "Take it slow, Mrs. Hill, one step at a time." Margaret gripped the walker, her legs trembling. Every step hurt, but she kept going. The hallway seemed endless. Nurses smiled as she passed, and one doctor nodded encouragingly. When she reached the end of the hall, she saw Maya standing near the nurses' station, talking to another doctor. She looked calm, professional, and focused. The two doctors were discussing a patient chart, but Maya's posture was relaxed, confident. Margaret felt something strange. Not anger, not exactly. It was something harder to understand. A mix of resentment and admiration. She didn't want to feel it, but she couldn't ignore it either. When their eyes met briefly, Maya gave her a small nod of encouragement. Margaret looked away, pretending to focus on the floor tiles. Back in her room, Oliver helped her sit down again. "Good job today," he said kindly. "You'll be walking on your own soon." Margaret managed a small smile. "Thanks." But as soon as he left, the silence crept back in. She stared at the small TV on the wall, the sound low, showing a morning talk show. The people on the screen were laughing, but it felt distant. Another world entirely. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the doctor. The more she thought about her, the more conflicted she became. She remembered the rumors she had believed for so long, the things she had said to friends in casual conversation, words she wasn't proud of now, though she had never questioned them before. And yet, here she was, alive, breathing, because of the very person she had judged without knowing. That night, as the hospital grew quiet again, Margaret couldn't sleep. She turned in bed, trying to find a comfortable position, but the discomfort wasn't just physical, it was emotional. A restlessness that came from seeing herself too clearly. She stared at the ceiling and whispered softly, "Why her? Why did it have to be her?" But deep down, she already knew the answer. 2 days later, the physical therapist came again, and this time Margaret walked farther. Her legs hurt, but she was stronger. Maya checked on her every morning, her voice steady, her tone always polite but distant enough to give space. One afternoon, a social worker came by to talk about discharge plans. "You'll probably be able to go home in a few days," she said. "The doctor will give final approval." Margaret nodded. "I see." That night she sat quietly by the window, watching the rain fall outside. The city lights blurred through the droplets, making everything look softer. She thought about her small antique shop, her home, her routine, all the things that had felt so important before. Now they seemed smaller. When the door opened, she turned, surprised to see Maya again. She wasn't expecting her this late. "Just wanted to check in before I leave for the night," Maya said with a kind smile. "How's the pain?" "Better," Margaret said quietly. "Thank you," Maya nodded. "Good. You're healing well." She adjusted the IV and checked the monitor. Then she looked at her for a moment longer, as if sensing the weight in the room. "You'll be okay once you're home. Just take it easy, follow the recovery plan." Margaret hesitated, then said, "You really don't have to come check on me this much." Maya gave a small shrug. "I know, but I want to." "Why?" "Because you're my patient," Maya said softly. "And because when someone almost dies, I like to make sure they know their life still matters." Margaret looked down at her hands. "Even if they don't think yours does?" Maya was quiet for a moment. Then she said gently, "Sometimes people see the world through fear, not truth. But fear can fade if you let it." She didn't say more. She simply smiled again and left the room, closing the door quietly. Margaret sat there for a long time after that, her heart heavy and her eyes blurry. She didn't understand why those words hurt, but they did, not because they were cruel, but because they were kind. The next morning, when Maya came by again, Margaret greeted her before she could speak. "Morning, doctor." Maya looked slightly surprised, but smiled. "Morning. You're looking better today." "I walked farther," Margaret said. "Almost to the elevator." "That's great," Maya said warmly. "You'll be ready for discharge soon." Margaret nodded. She wanted to say something else, something about the guilt sitting heavy in her chest, but the words wouldn't come. Over the next few days, their short exchanges became more natural. They never talked about race, never talked about the unspoken wall between them, but something was shifting quietly. Maya treated her the same as she always had, with respect, calmness, and care. And for the first time, Margaret started to see her not as a label, but as a person. On the last night before her discharge, the nurses brought in paperwork for her to sign. Maya stopped by again, wearing her usual calm smile. "Well," Maya said, glancing at the chart, "looks like you're almost ready to go home." Margaret nodded. "I guess I am. You'll have a nurse visit for a few days to make sure everything's okay. And if you need anything, call the number on the form." Margaret took a deep breath. "Doctor, may I ask something?" "Of course." "When you saw me that night in the emergency room, and did you know who I was?" Maya thought for a moment. "No, I didn't know your name until after surgery." "So you didn't know what kind of person I was?" Maya met her eyes. "I knew you were a person who needed help. That's all I needed to know." Margaret swallowed hard. Her throat felt tight. I've said some terrible things in my life, she whispered. About people I didn't even know. People like you. Maya stayed silent, her expression calm. Margaret continued, her voice trembling. And then you. You saved me. You stayed all night. You didn't even hesitate, Maya spoke softly. That's what compassion is, doing what's right, even when it's not easy. Tears filled Margaret's eyes, but she blinked them away quickly. I don't know how to thank you, she said. I don't know how to fix what's in my head. You don't have to fix it all at once, Maya said gently. Just start by seeing people for who they are, not what they look like. That's where healing begins. Margaret nodded, unable to speak. When Maya left the room, Margaret finally let the tears fall. They weren't just tears of guilt. They were tears of awakening, of realization. That night she couldn't sleep again. She kept hearing Maya's words. That's where healing begins. As dawn broke, the sky outside turned soft pink. Margaret packed the few things she had in a small bag. The nurse came in to help with discharge papers. Your doctor will stop by to sign the final forms, the nurse said cheerfully. A few minutes later, Maya walked in one last time. She signed the papers and smiled warmly. You did great. Remember, take your medicine on time, avoid lifting anything heavy, and rest as much as you can. Margaret nodded. Then quietly she said, Doctor, I used to think people like us were different. Maya tilted her head. People like us? Margaret gave a small, sad smile. You know what I mean. But now I see I was wrong. We all just want to live, don't we? Maya's eyes softened. Yes, we all just want to live. There was silence for a moment, then Margaret extended her hand slowly. Thank you. For everything. Maya shook her hand gently. You're welcome. Take care of yourself. As Margaret was wheeled out of the hospital, she looked back one last time. Through the glass doors, she could see Maya talking with another patient. Smiling, calm, steady as ever. Something deep inside Margaret shifted. A quiet change that words couldn't fully describe. For the first time, she felt grateful not just for her life, but for the lesson it had brought with it. Outside, the world looked brighter than before. The air felt different. She didn't know what the future would hold or if she could truly change overnight. But she knew one thing for sure. She would never look at people the same way again. And somewhere inside that busy hospital, a doctor went on with her day, never knowing that her kindness had planted the first seed of change in someone who needed it most. The morning air outside the hospital felt colder than Margaret expected. As the nurse helped her into the waiting car, she turned back for one last look. The tall white building stood quietly under the cloudy sky, its windows shining faintly in the sun. Inside those walls, she had almost lost her life and found something unexpected. Her sister had come to pick her up, insisting she stay with her for a few days before returning home. You need rest, her sister said, adjusting the seatbelt around her. You're not going to be lifting furniture and running around that shop yet, Margaret smiled faintly. Don't worry. I'm not planning on doing much of anything. The drive was quiet at first. The sound of tires against the road filled the car. Her sister talked about small things, the weather, the bakery reopening downtown, a neighbor's new puppy. But Margaret's mind was somewhere else. Every time she closed her eyes, she could still see the hospital lights, the calm face of the woman who had saved her. Her sister glanced at her. You're awfully quiet. Thinking about the accident? A little, Margaret said. Can you believe it's been 2 weeks already? You were lucky. The doctor said it was bad. Margaret nodded slowly. Yes, very bad. When they reached her sister's home, Margaret was helped inside and she sat on the couch near the window. The house smelled like lemon polish and fresh coffee. Her sister fussed over her, bringing pillows, blankets, and tea, but Margaret's thoughts were far away. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, she sat alone with the lamp on. She looked at the scars on her arms, faint but visible. Then she remembered the steady hands that had stitched those wounds closed. She whispered softly to herself. She didn't have to care, but she did. The next morning, her sister helped her sit in the backyard to get some fresh air. The garden was quiet, filled with the smell of wet soil after rain. Birds chirped softly on the fence. Margaret sat wrapped in a blanket, staring at the sky. Her sister joined her with 2 cups of tea. So what's on your mind? she asked gently. Margaret hesitated. Do you believe people can change? Her sister looked surprised. Change? Of course, why? Margaret took a deep breath. Because I think, maybe I need to. Her sister tilted her head, curious. What brought this on? Margaret didn't answer right away. She sipped her tea slowly, then said, Do you know the doctor who operated on me? The one who saved you? Yes, I saw her once when I visited. Seemed kind. She is, Margaret said softly. She's not who I expected. Or maybe she's exactly who I didn't expect. Her sister nodded quietly, understanding more than Margaret said aloud. She must have made an impression. She did, Margaret admitted. I've spent most of my life thinking things that now make me ashamed. And then she comes along, calm, gentle, and saves me without asking who I am or what I believe. It's like everything I thought I knew doesn't make sense anymore. Her sister reached over and touched her hand. Maybe that's life's way of teaching you something. Margaret gave a small, sad smile. Maybe. Days passed, and slowly her body healed. The bruises faded, the pain lessened. But inside, something kept stirring. She found herself replaying small moments in her mind. The sound of Maya's voice in the ICU, the calm look in her eyes, the words she had spoken softly. Sometimes people see the world through fear, not truth. One afternoon, Margaret picked up her phone and called the hospital. The receptionist answered cheerfully. Good afternoon, City General Hospital. How can I help you? Margaret hesitated, then said, I'd like to leave a message for Dr. Thompson. She was my surgeon a few weeks ago. Just tell her. Thank you. For everything. Of course, the receptionist said. Would you like to schedule a follow-up visit too? Margaret thought for a moment. Yes, I think I would. A week later, she was back at the hospital, walking slowly with her cane. The same building that had once felt cold and frightening now seemed familiar. When she reached the front desk, the nurse smiled warmly. Mrs. Hill, you're looking much better. I feel better, Margaret said honestly. She waited quietly until the nurse led her down the hall. Her heart beat faster with every step. When Maya walked into the room a few minutes later, her usual calm smile appeared. Well, this is a good surprise, Maya said softly. You look wonderful. How are you feeling? Margaret smiled back, a little nervous. Stronger every day. I'm glad to hear that. Any pain? Not much. Just some soreness here and there. Maya checked her vitals, listened to her heartbeat, and reviewed her chart. Everything looked fine. You're healing beautifully. Keep following your exercise plan and you'll be back to normal soon. Margaret hesitated, then said quietly, I didn't just come for the checkup. Maya looked up. Oh, I came to thank you properly. I didn't know how to say it before, Maya smiled gently. You already did. The best thank you is seeing you well. No, Margaret said, shaking her head. That's not enough. You didn't just save my life. You made me think about how I've been living it. There was a long pause. The room felt still, filled with something unspoken but powerful. I spent a lot of years believing things that made me small inside, Margaret said. And now I can't stop thinking about how wrong I was. You could have let me die, but you didn't. You cared anyway. I don't know how to live with that except to be better. Maya listened quietly, her expression soft but thoughtful. Maybe that's what life gives us sometimes, she said finally. A chance to start over, to be better than we were yesterday. Margaret's eyes glistened. I want to be. I don't even know where to start. Start with kindness, Maya said, the same way I started. One person at a time, Margaret nodded slowly. Thank you. When the appointment ended, Maya walked her to the elevator. They exchanged a small, genuine smile, not the polite kind, but one that said they both understood something the other didn't have to say aloud. On the ride home, Margaret felt lighter than she had in years. Her sister noticed immediately. You seem different, she said. I am, Margaret replied. Or at least I'm trying to be. That evening, Margaret sat by the window again, watching children play on the sidewalk. 2 kids were chasing a ball, laughing loudly, their skin different shades of brown and tan. A few months ago, she might have noticed that difference, but now all she saw were 2 children being happy. Something warm spread through her chest, a quiet sense of peace. The next day, she opened her antique shop again. The closed for recovery sign came down, replaced with open. Neighbors came by to check on her, bringing flowers and warm wishes. One customer, a young man with dark skin, walked in looking for an old clock. Margaret smiled at him genuinely this time. Take your time. There's a few on the back shelf. He thanked her and looked around. When he brought one to the counter, she wrapped it carefully and said, "You know, I used to have one like this when I was a little girl." He smiled. "Really? My grandmother had the same one too." They shared a small laugh, nothing special, but for Margaret it felt like something new, a connection without barriers. Later that night she called her sister again. "You know what I realized today?" she said. "What?" "People aren't as different as I thought. We just pretend they are." Her sister smiled through the phone. "Sounds like you're finally seeing the world with open eyes." "Maybe for the first time," Margaret admitted. Weeks turned into months. Margaret continued her recovery and even started volunteering once a week at a local health center, helping organize donation drives. She met people from all backgrounds, all stories, and she found herself listening in a way she never had before. One day, while sorting supplies, she overheard two volunteers talking about discrimination they'd faced. She wanted to say something, but she didn't know what. Then she simply said, "I used to be one of the people who didn't understand. I'm trying to change that now." They looked at her with surprise, then smiled. One of them said softly, "That's all anyone can do, try." That night, Margaret sat on her porch under the stars. She thought about the accident, the surgery, and the doctor whose kindness had quietly rewritten the story of her life. Sometimes she still felt shame for her past words and thoughts, but she didn't let it crush her anymore. She saw it as a reminder of where she'd come from and how far she still wanted to go. One afternoon, she returned to the hospital again, not for treatment, but for something else. She brought a small package wrapped in brown paper and asked the front desk to deliver it to Dr. Thompson's office. Inside the package was an old silver locket, one from her shop, polished until it shone. Inside she had placed a small note. It said simply, "For the one who healed more than just my body, thank you for showing me what real humanity looks like." When Maya opened the package later that day, she smiled. She placed the locket gently in her desk drawer and sat for a moment, staring out the window at the city below. She thought about all the people she had treated over the years, some grateful, some angry, some afraid. But this one had been different, not because of who Margaret was when she arrived, but because of who she became after she left. Maya whispered quietly to herself, "Maybe that's what healing really means." Outside, the city moved on busy as ever, but inside two hearts, something lasting had changed. One had learned compassion in action. The other had learned to see past fear and prejudice to the simple truth that kindness had no color, no boundary, no limit. And though they would go back to their separate lives, both women would carry the memory of that night, one where a life was saved, and another where a soul was reborn. It was not just a story about a doctor and a patient. It was a story about humanity, fragile, flawed, but capable of grace when least expected, and in that truth both of them found peace. Months passed, and the cold air of winter slowly began to fade. The trees outside the antique shop were starting to bloom again, their branches covered in soft pink and white flowers. Margaret stood near the front window, watching as the wind carried a few petals down the street. Life, she thought, was finally beginning to feel peaceful again. Inside the shop, the smell of old wood and lavender polish filled the air. The shelves were lined with clocks, vases, and framed photos from another time. Customers came and went, most of them regulars now. Many stopped to ask how she was doing, and she always smiled and said, "Better than ever." But deep down, Margaret knew her healing wasn't just physical. Something in her heart had truly changed. She was softer, more patient, more aware. She noticed people now, not just their faces, but their moods, their silences, their small struggles. It was as if the world had opened its doors to her for the first time. One afternoon, as she was arranging books near the back shelf, the little bell on the shop door rang. She looked up and saw a familiar face. It was Maya, the doctor who had saved her life. Margaret froze for a moment, her hands still resting on the stack of books. "Well," she said with a surprised smile, "this is unexpected." Maya returned the smile, calm and warm as always. "I was in the neighborhood. Thought I'd stop by and see how my favorite patient was doing." Margaret laughed softly. "I think I'm officially retired from being a patient. But I'm glad you came." The two women sat down near the front counter, The sunlight poured through the window, lighting up the dust in the air like tiny stars. "I got your gift," Maya said, touching the silver locket around her neck. "It meant more than I can say." Margaret nodded. "It was the least I could do. I wanted to give you something that would last." Maya looked around the shop. "You've built quite a beautiful place here. Everything seems to tell a story." "They do," Margaret said. "Some stories are old, some forgotten. But I think everything deserves to be seen again, don't you?" Maya smiled. "I do." There was a moment of quiet between them, not awkward, but peaceful. Then Margaret said, "You know, I've been thinking about what you told me, about kindness. I've been trying to live by that." Maya's eyes softened. "How's that going?" "It's harder than I thought," Margaret admitted with a chuckle. "Sometimes I still catch myself thinking in old ways. But now I notice it, and I try to do better. It's not perfect, but I'm trying." "That's what matters," Maya said gently. "Change doesn't happen overnight. It's something you practice, like healing." Margaret nodded. "You know, I even started volunteering at the community center, sorting food donations, helping with local events. The people there are kind and patient with me. I'm learning a lot from them." "That's wonderful," Maya said. "You've come a long way." "I've had good teachers," Margaret said meaningfully. They both laughed softly. Then Maya looked thoughtful. "You know, people don't always understand what compassion really is. They think it's just helping others. But sometimes it's also forgiving yourself." Margaret looked down, her hands folded. "That part's still hard. I think about things I've said in the past, people I've hurt without realizing it. I wish I could take it all back." "You can't change what's already happened," Maya said kindly. "But you can choose what you do now. That's how we make peace with the past." Margaret's eyes glistened. "You make it sound so simple." "It's not," Maya said with a small laugh. "But it's worth trying." The afternoon light grew warmer as they talked. Customers came and went quietly, giving the two women space. They spoke about life, about family, about how fragile everything could be. After a while, Maya stood up. "I should get going. My shift starts soon." Margaret stood too. "Thank you for coming, really, you didn't have to." "I wanted to," Maya said. "Sometimes doctors don't get to see what happens after. It's nice to know the story didn't end in that hospital." Margaret smiled. "No, it didn't, it just began." Maya reached out and gently squeezed her hand. "Take care of yourself." "I will," Margaret said. "And thank you again, not just for saving me, but for waking me up." Maya gave a small nod, her eyes warm. Then she turned and left, the bell over the door ringing softly behind her. Margaret stood there for a long moment after she was gone. The world outside looked bright and alive, and for the first time in many years she felt truly at peace. That night, she wrote in her journal, something she'd started doing during her recovery. She wrote, "Sometimes, life gives us a mirror when we least expect it, and sometimes the person who holds it up is a stranger, but in their kindness we see who we could be." Weeks passed. The antique shop continued to bloom with life. New faces came in, and Margaret found joy in every small exchange. One day, a young girl came into the shop looking nervous. She couldn't have been more than 10 years old. She carried a few coins in her hand. "Excuse me," she said shyly. "Do you sell lockets?" Margaret smiled and bent down a little so they were eye to eye. "I do. Are you looking for something special?" The girl nodded. "It's for my mom's birthday. I don't have a lot of money, but I wanted to get her something nice." Margaret's heart softened. "Let me see what I can find." She went to the glass case and opened a small box. Inside was a simple gold locket. Not expensive, but beautiful. She handed it to the girl. "This one's perfect. It's strong, just like your mom." The girl looked worried. "I don't think I can afford it." Margaret smiled. "It's already paid for. Someone once gave me a gift that changed my life. Now I'm passing it on." The girl's face lit up. "Really, thank you, ma'am." "Just promise me one thing," Margaret said softly. "When you give it to her, tell her it's from someone who believes kindness never ends." The girl nodded eagerly and ran out, clutching the locket. As the door closed, Margaret stood there for a moment smiling. She felt something deep and calm move through her. The same warmth she had felt in that hospital room months ago. That night, as the sun set over the town, she sat on her porch again, watching the sky turn orange and pink. Her sister joined her with 2 cups of tea. "You look happy," her sister said. "I am," Margaret replied. "I think I finally understand what life is about. Oh? And what's that? About giving back what you've been given, Margaret said. And forgiving yourself for what you didn't know before. Her sister smiled softly. You've really changed. Margaret looked down at her hands, then at the street where children were riding their bikes, their laughter filling the air. I had to, she said. Life gave me a second chance. I couldn't waste it. Later that evening, she took out her old journal again. The pages were filled with thoughts, sketches, and lessons she'd learned along the way. She turned to a blank page and began to write. I once believed that kindness belonged only to people who looked like me, thought like me, lived like me. But I was wrong. Kindness has no face, no color, no limit. It exists in everyone, if we're brave enough to see it. As she closed the journal, tears filled her eyes. Not of sadness, but of gratitude. Across town, at the hospital, Maya sat in her office after a long shift. The silver locket around her neck caught the light as she leaned back in her chair. On her desk was a small stack of patient files, but her mind drifted for a moment to the woman she had met months ago. She thought about the way Margaret had smiled that day in the shop, how her eyes had held peace instead of anger. It reminded her why she had chosen this path. Not for recognition, but for moments like that. Moments when a life didn't just continue, but transformed. She opened a small notebook and wrote a note of her own. Healing doesn't always happen on the operating table. Sometimes it happens quietly in the way people learn to love again. The world outside was quiet. Streetlights flickered on one by one. Maya gathered her things and left the hospital, walking into the cool evening air. The city hummed softly around her, full of lives crossing and reconnecting in ways no one could ever fully understand. Months later, Margaret's antique shop became something more than a store. It became a little place of peace in the town. People came not just to buy things, but to talk, to share stories, to feel welcome. Margaret would always greet them with a warm smile and a cup of tea. She never spoke much about the accident or the surgery or the doctor who saved her. But sometimes when people shared their worries or their pain, she would tell them softly, "You never know how life will surprise you. Sometimes the person you think least of might be the one who saves you." The people would smile, nod, and leave the shop feeling a little lighter. Years later, long after the accident had faded into memory, the locket she had given to Maya still sat close to the doctor's heart. And in Margaret's shop, kindness continued to ripple, from one person to another, like light passing from one window to the next. In a world that often divided itself with walls and words, two strangers had proved something simple yet profound, that humanity, when given a chance, always finds a way to heal, and maybe that was the truest form of medicine there was. Years had passed since the night Margaret's life was saved. The little antique shop on the corner of the street had become a quiet symbol of warmth in the town. People knew it not only for its old treasures, but for the calm, kind woman who ran it. The shop had changed over time, not just in appearance, but in spirit. The wooden floors were polished from years of footsteps. The bell over the door still jingled gently each time a customer walked in, and the shelves were filled with little pieces of history. Yet the real magic wasn't in the items on display, but in the feeling people got when they stepped inside. Margaret had become known for her listening ear. People often stopped by not just to browse, but to talk about their worries, their joys, their dreams. She never rushed them, never judged, just listened. It was something she'd learned from someone who once listened to her without judgment. Sometimes when the shop was quiet, she'd sit by the window with her cup of tea, watching life outside. Children running home from school, couples walking hand in hand, neighbors chatting on the street. All these simple moments filled her heart. She often thought about the doctor who had changed her life. Though they didn't see each other often, she still sent a card every year around the same time. A simple note with words of gratitude and peace. And every year a card came back, written in the same calm handwriting. It was their quiet tradition. One day, as Margaret was unpacking a new set of antiques, the bell rang and a young woman walked in. She looked nervous but curious, holding a notebook and a pen. "Hello," she said shyly. "I'm doing a project for the local paper. It's about people in our town who've made a difference. Everyone told me I should talk to you." Margaret blinked, a little surprised. "To me? I'm not sure I belong in a story like that." The young woman smiled. "I think you do. People say your shop feels like home." that you've helped a lot of folks without even realizing it. Margaret chuckled softly. Well, if you're looking for heroes, you might be in the wrong place. I'm just an old woman selling old things. Maybe, the young woman said, but sometimes the quietest people change the most lives. Margaret thought about that for a moment, then nodded toward the table near the window. All right, you can sit here. Would you like some tea? The girl smiled. Yes, please. They sat together as the light from the window spilled across the table. The young reporter asked questions about the shop, when it started, why she opened it, what she loved most about it. Margaret answered simply, her voice steady and thoughtful. Then the girl asked, Was there ever a moment that changed everything for you? Margaret looked down at her hands. There was a long pause. Then she said quietly, Yes, there was. The girl leaned forward, curious. Would you tell me about it? Margaret took a deep breath. Years ago, I was in an accident. It was bad. I should have died that night. But someone saved me, a doctor. A woman who didn't know me, who didn't ask who I was or what I believed. She just did her job with kindness and grace. At the time, I didn't understand how important that was. I had spent most of my life seeing the world through fear and pride. And she showed me something different. She showed me what real humanity looks like. The girl listened closely, her pen still. What happened after? I healed, Margaret said softly. Not just my body, but my heart. I realized that the world isn't divided the way I used to think. That kindness doesn't have a color, and compassion doesn't care about who you are. I decided to live differently after that. To listen more, to care more, to be better. The girl smiled gently. That's beautiful. It's true, Margaret said. Sometimes the person who saves your life doesn't just fix your body. They wake up your soul. The young reporter wrote that down, her eyes thoughtful. Do you still see her? Margaret shook her head. Not often, but I think of her every day. I send her a card once a year, just to remind her that she didn't just save a life, she changed one. When the interview ended, the young woman thanked her and left. But something about that conversation stayed with Margaret. That night, she closed the shop early and sat by the window with her journal. She opened to a blank page and wrote slowly, I once thought forgiveness was a gift we gave others, but it's also a gift we give ourselves, or to live without the weight of hate. She closed the book and sat quietly. The street outside was calm, the lamps casting soft light over the cobblestones. A few days later, she received a letter in the mail. The handwriting was familiar. It was from the doctor. Margaret opened it carefully and began to read. Dear Margaret, your letters always remind me why I chose this path. Sometimes in the rush of work and the noise of life, I forget what healing really means. You remind me that it's not just about medicine. It's about hearts, too. I'm proud of you. I hope you're still sharing your light with others, and the world needs more of it. With warmth, M. Margaret smiled. Her eyes filled with quiet tears. She placed the letter in her journal, between pages filled with lessons and reflections. The next week, something unexpected happened. The local paper published an article titled, The Heart of the Town, How One Woman's Kindness Changed a Community. It was about her. People came into the shop that week to congratulate her. Some brought flowers, others just smiles. She accepted their kindness with humility, always saying the same thing. I didn't do anything special. I just learned how to care. But one afternoon, as she was rearranging the shelves, she looked up and saw a familiar figure at the door. It was Maya again, the doctor. Margaret's heart lifted. You saw the article, didn't you? Maya laughed softly. I did. I couldn't resist coming by after reading it. Seems you've been busy changing lives. Margaret blushed slightly. Oh, I think you've done far more of that than I ever will. Maybe, Maya said. But you've done something just as powerful. You've inspired people to see differently. They sat together again, just like before. Two women from different worlds bound by one quiet act of compassion. Margaret looked at her and said, You know, I used to think that saving someone's life was about skill. But now I think it's also about love, the kind that asks for nothing in return. Maya nodded. That's the truest kind. They talked for a long time. About work, about life, about how time changes people in ways they never expect. When it was time to leave, Maya hugged her gently. You've done more than you realize, Maya whispered. Sometimes healing keeps spreading long after the medicine is gone. After she left, Margaret stood for a while by the door, watching her walk away. The world outside felt calm and full, like everything was right where it belonged. Years went by quietly. Margaret grew older, but her spirit stayed bright. She kept the shop open as long as she could until the day came when her hands began to tremble too much to wrap the fragile antiques. She decided it was time to let go. On the last day, she placed a small sign on the door. Thank you for the memories. This isn't goodbye, just a new beginning. People from the town came to say farewell. Many brought small gifts, letters, and flowers. One man said softly, "You may not know it, but you've changed how we treat each other around here." Margaret smiled, her eyes warm.